right, it's week 14 in the NFL, and Kirko is making his return to US Bank Stadium. Can these Falcons get back in the win column today against a 10-2 tough to beat Minnesota Vikings team? Thank you guys for joining us for the Falcons pregame show presented by Ticketmaster. Taylor, Vismor and Derek Rackley, we're with you for the next 30 minutes. I mean, this is a big game today, not just for this Falcons team, but for Kirk Cousins in specific.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a bounce back game. I mean, that's what we're going to see today from Kirk Cousins. Well, at least we hope that he's going to bounce back today. Right. I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges when you come off a game like Kirk had last week against the Chargers. That's what you're hoping for, a guy that you sign as a veteran like that, right? The guy that can put last week, and move forward to next week. So that's the challenge today. He's going up against a really talented Minnesota Vikings team.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Kirk Cousins a little bit later and what happened last week and what the expectations are for him this week. But right now, because of that loss against the Los Angeles Chargers, the NFC South is tied right now. I mean, the race is coming down to the last couple of weeks in the regular season. Tampa and the Falcons are tied for first right now. The Buccaneers are they're hosting, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the Falcons, of course, will be on the road next week to the Raiders. Yep. So this is a big week to watch the Buccaneers, to see what they're doing, and then, of course, for the Falcons to get a win back in the column.
Yeah, it's one of those games where if you're Atlanta, you're a player on the team, you're a coach, you're part of the personnel, upper front office, if you will, you're not thinking about what is Tampa doing, but you know that Tampa is hosting, okay, they're hosting a 2-10 Raiders team, a team that is reeling. So you're thinking, okay, maybe Tampa has the upper hand in that matchup. But aside from all of that, your focus is trying to get off of this 3-game losing streak and playing against a really difficult Minnesota Vikings team in a very difficult environment, and having to manage all the emotions that come with Kirk Cousins going up against his former team, coming off of the game that he had last week. So yes, you're always thinking about the standings, you're aware of the standings, but you're not necessarily concerned what's happening with Tampa today because you've got your hands full with the opponent that's in front of you.
Right, I read one of Tori McElhaney's stories. I always love reading her and Taryn and, of course, Will McFadden and all their stories on the Subhon as well. And Tori was kind of saying, like, at the beginning of the season, the whole motto, and still now, is to outrun the South, right? And at the beginning, we're still 4-1 in this division, right? But the Falcons were really outrunning the South. But now, with 5 games left, you're tied for the NFC South, and it's really going to be a sprint to the end against the Falcons and really the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So it's going to be interesting, and I think we've talked about the last 3 weeks how these are must-win games now. Today, in my opinion, this is a must-win game. And like you said, Rackley, it is a hard environment to go into. It's well known throughout the league as one of the hardest places to play in the league. Whether you're an NFC opponent or an AFC opponent, it doesn't matter. These fans are rabid and they love their Minnesota Vikings. And who better knows that fan base than Kirk Cousins? He's returning for the first time to US Bank Stadium, going into the visiting locker room, which I actually spoke to him about returning to the Commanders when he first was with the Vikings and played the Commanders. And he said, it's weird, man. Like, you go into the building and you're so thankful for everything that they had given you and the opportunity and the lessons that you learned while you were there, but you're going into the visiting locker room and you're going through a tunnel that you've never been through before, and it's a different feeling. So let's talk about Kirk Cousins, because looking at last week, Raheem Morris said it best after that in their press conference, post-game press conference, saying, hey, listen, you cannot turn the ball over 4 times as a team and expect to win the game. And I think that kind of summarizes what happened against the Los Angeles Chargers perfectly for this offense. When you look at what happened last week with Kirk Cousins, what are your expectations for him going into this week? Yeah,
I think my expectations are for him to be the pro that he is, to be the quarterback and the player that he is, because he has been in this situation before, unfortunately. If you play long enough in the National Football League, you're going to have some disastrous games. I mean, I think you could probably look at the best quarterbacks in the league. They would probably point to, if not one, multiple games that they played poorly. So for Kirk Cousins, if my Derek Rackley stats analysis checks out, which I will tell you there's probably some flaws in it. However, I counted 7 games in his career where he's had 3 or more interceptions in a game. And following that, obviously that's what we're looking at today. Following that, I think you could say the results have been mixed. He has not had 2 disastrous games back-to-back to my recollection, but he has had games where he's come back and he's thrown 2 touchdowns and no interceptions and they've won, and he's had games that they have lost. So he has been in this situation before. Unfortunately, you learn from the previous experiences, but you don't think about it. You don't harp on them. His goal is to go out today and try to execute today's game plan. Learn from what happened last week, but don't think about what happened last week, and don't let that creep into your mind. If for some reason he's got a bad first couple of drives, if for some reason he throws an interception early in the game, you cannot let those thoughts start creeping in from last week or the previous instances where you had bad games, because that's when it's going to start snowballing out of control.
Yeah, and for Kirk Cousins, it really has not been last week. It was really the last 3 weeks, or really last 3 games, excuse me, because it's been 4 weeks with that bye in the middle. But the last 3 games that he's played, he's had a completion rate of 62.9%, excuse me, no touchdown receptions and 6 interceptions. The 3 weeks before that, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Let me ask you this, Rack, because you used to be a teammate on the offense. You know how quarterbacks work and how black and white a lot of them see things, right? When your quarterback goes on a slump such as this one, right? How do you help his mental? Because yes, he has his own way of doing things. He has his own, weekly, routine that he goes in his process, if you will. But how do you help his mental as a teammate on that offense?
Well, a couple of ways. Number one, you just encourage him. You support him just like you would when he's playing his greatest. You do that when he is not playing his best. But even more so, if I'm a receiver, if I'm a running back, if I'm an offensive lineman, I do a little bit more to get my quarterbacks back. You understand what I'm saying by that? Like, if you're the offensive line, your job is to make sure that nobody gets in the backfield to allow Kirk Cousins the most time to be able to operate and find his receiver. And if you're a receiver, if you're a running back coming out of the backfield, you want to get your quarterbacks back. If he makes a throw that's a little bit offline and maybe you've got to make somewhat of a circus catch, you make it, right? That's how you show your confidence for the quarterback, is you go make plays for him. You make contested catches. You make that 50-50 catch with tight coverage on top of you that not only gets yourself excited, but it gets your team excited. But you go back to the huddle and you look Kirk Cousins in the eyes and you say, I got you, bro.
Yeah.
That's how you support a guy in that situation. I'm here to make plays for you. Let's go win the game.
Yeah, and I think the mental, too, with quarterbacks especially, is very similar to that of a pitcher in the MLB and college baseball as well, is that they can get in their heads really quickly and they'll lose their touch just that fast.
Sure.
And I think it's really interesting when guys go to the mound in baseball, it's not always like, hey, calm down. Hey, you're doing great. Sometimes it just depends on who the guy is. Maybe you need to crack a joke to him. Hey, loosen up. Like, we're having fun. This is a kid's game. Just let it rip. Have fun. And I think it really depends on who knows Kirk the best and how they can get him out of his head. And yes, he's only been here for 14 weeks and a little bit through the offseason, but it's that now is the time that those offensive linemen, that those running backs, those wide receivers who know him, have spent time with him, can either crack a joke, say something inspirational, get him hyped, fired up. It's all about who Kirk Cousins is and what makes him tick, and that's what those teammates know about Kirk Cousins. But what was interesting this week is obviously did not have the greatest game of his life against the Chargers, and when that happens, the media room fills up. Reporters are here, news outlets are here, newspapers are here. Everyone's here because they want to know what's going on with Kirk Cousins and this offense. And of course, Raheem Morris, Kirk Cousins both, they answered the questions that everyone was wondering this week.
Last week, we had a tough foot game. We didn't play well, particularly well at quarterback. And not many times can you absolutely say that to your guy and you talk to him in the right way, in the right tone, and it's all agreed upon and what needs to happen and what needs to get better for us to keep going. So, everything starts with me. Obviously, the quarterback and the head coach get all the blame for all those type of things, and they also get all the credit. And when we were winning, we got all the credit, and now we deserve all the blame, and now we got to go out there and fix it.
And so it's just kind of been a deal where this league and football and my journey is, it always kicks you down and you got to find a way to get back up and find myself there again. I wish I would say it. I don't. I wish I could say I wasn't in that spot, but I find myself there again and have to just believe that tough times don't last. Tough people do, and you just keep going and pushing. And at some point, they'll tell you that, hey, you're not going to get another chance. Your time is up in this league. But until then, I'm going to keep trying to pick myself up off the mat and get back to work.
All right, tough times don't last, tough people do. We'll see if he's a tough guy today against the Vikings. But, speaking of the Vikings, this is an emotional day for Kirk Cousins. And we're going to talk about this just real quickly. This is an emotional day for him. He was there for 6 years. He started a family there. He actually he welcomed his second son in Minnesota. I know that Julie Cousins and the rest of his family went up early to see their friends and their family. This is an emotional day for Kirk Cousins, but it's also a day that he needs to prove something. So if you're Kirk Cousins, how do you weigh the two and go out and play your best ball today?
It's a great question, and one that I've talked about in a couple of different occasions, because what everybody has to understand is even though he's a celebrity, even though he's very highly paid, even though he's the face of the franchise, there's also a human element goes behind this, because Kirk and his family, they have friends just like you have friends at home. And they have people that they want to go catch up with just like you have friends that you want to go catch up with. So I'm completely fine with all of that. There's also two sides to this, right? There's kind of the 30,000 foot view, if you will. You're flying in an airplane and you're looking down everything from the top. It's the going back to your former team and seeing your friends and seeing a place and all the respect that you have for the organization, the people that helped you out the previous 6 years, going to see some of your former teammates. Okay, that's the 30,000 foot. But then there's this thing called the Atlanta Falcons, and his job as the starting quarterback, coming off of arguably his worst game in his career, trying to get this team off of a 3-game losing streak and trying to get them back into the driver's seat of the division and getting into the playoff race. That's the one that's the most important right now, is the laser focus. So there are two things that he has to juggle, both of them equally as important, the personal side, the professional side. But I'm sure Kirk would tell you that today, once he steps foot on that field in Minnesota, his job is to go out, just like he said, I'm going to root for them every other time except this Sunday when they're playing the team that I'm now the quarterback for.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. And obviously, I feel like those conversations, those hugs, those hey, how are yous will happen pre and post game. But when the clock strikes and you're playing and the coin is flipped and you're choosing sides on which way you're going, it's time to play. It's time to go to work. It's time to do your job that the Falcons paid you $180 million to do. So that's, I mean, it's 4 quarters, 60 minutes. Your job happens in those 4 quarters and 60 minutes. So it's not all about the goo-goo gagas and we're all back. We love this place, whatever. But I actually sat down with Kirk Cousins to talk to him about how special the return to Minnesota would be for him this week. What excites you the most about returning to U.S. Bank?
Cousins going deep in the end zone, touchdown! Cousins, deep shot, got a man, you bet! Touchdown!
Yeah, 6 years is a long time. I'm very grateful for 6 years with Minnesota. The organization was so good to me, they were so good to my family. But even beyond the team, the people of Minnesota were so good to our family. I think of my neighbors who lived across the cul-de-sac, who constantly looked after our house, or just took pressure off of me and off of our family to provide help. They were a reflection of really the whole state and the way they supported us, and it was why it was emotional when we needed to leave.
Cousins is going to the Atlanta Falcons. He is leaving Minnesota. He is going to Atlanta.
There's so many people in that organization who mean a great deal to me, and it creates a strange feeling playing against them. I'd prefer to just have my opponent be a total stranger, but that's not the case playing Minnesota. You wish the best for all of them, except for this game day when you're playing them.
Gonna throw, caught, touchdown Atlanta!
I'm sure there's an element inside of him that wants to prove to the coaching staff and the players that he's the guy that's going to win. For sure. And he's the guy that's going to get them into the postseason.
Well, it's a strange feeling to go back to a place that you used to be the home team and now you're the away team for the game. It's also a blessed feeling of gratitude when you walk into that environment and you're transported back to all those memories.
It will be an emotional week for him getting ready for this Minnesota game. How do you think he'll respond with all the attention with him going back to play the Vikings?
He's a pro. He's be able to, handle it. I think put some fire in him, go back with a nice crew, make some noise.
How do you go about going back to a place where you had so much success and trying to handle it?
He knows exactly what the place is going to be like. It's ruckus.
Yeah. If there's a guy that you expect to be able to filter all that out mentally, Kirk Cousins is as cerebral a guy as I've ever seen.
If the return to Minnesota is anything like turning to Washington, D.C. To play the Commanders, the emotion you feel or the first thought I have is gratitude.
All right, I love those features because you're always voicing them, which is always so fun. I'm like, oh my God, that's Rackley. And you said something about the ruckus that U.S. Bank Stadium will be. Like I said earlier, and I think you said it too, is this place is rocking. Doesn't matter if it's an NFC team or an NFC North team. Doesn't matter what team it is. this fan base is rabid about their Vikings, and it's going to be hard for Kirk Cousins to go in there. I think it's probably, those tickets probably sold out a little bit earlier for this one in particular because of his return. But let's talk about when the fans are loud. That's when their defense is out, and they've been lights out this year. Let's talk about this Minnesota Vikings defense. What have you made of this defense so far?
Very attacking style of defense. Brian Flores is a very respected defensive mind and coordinator in this league. And even Raheem Morris earlier in the week talked a lot about him and his style as what he does and how he tries to create confusion with the zero blitz or the bluff zeros. These are things that he talked about earlier this week, and how you have to sort out those different looks, how you got to find the little nuances on what they're showing with their alignment, their movement, their personnel, with who you have on the field. All of those different things have to be processed, mostly by Kirk Cousins, to have success against a team that likes to attack. So, yes, he's going to have his hands full. He's going to see a lot of blitz. But the one thing I can tell you about blitz for a quarterback is that generally means you've got options down the field. Generally means you're going to get man coverage. You're going to have some opportunities for some big-time plays. Every good veteran quarterback that I talk to says, bring pressure. We like it because that's our opportunity to change the game.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up man coverage because when you look at this Brian Flores defense, and I think just throughout his time in the league, he just loves to have a defense that creates constant chaos for the quarterback all 4 quarters, and this Minnesota Vikings defense is no exception. Look, he loves bringing pressure. He loves blitzing, whether that's bringing 5, bringing 6, or just bringing 4 and creating constant pressure against the quarterback. But when this defense does create pressure against the quarterback, this secondary really does not play a ton of man. They play a lot of zone, giving them more opportunities to intercept the ball, but also in a good way gives Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Kyle Pitts a little bit more separation from that secondary player. So how does that kind of help in a way, having that pressure, but also giving them space from that secondary?
Well, again, it's recognition because a lot of times there are adjustments on routes, right? You come out of them with certain angles or acceleration versus man coverage that you don't necessarily with zone. For instance, you get man coverage on an in-breaking route. You have to continue your route. You got to continue to run away from the defender that's trailing you, create separation. However, if you're running that same route and you've got zone, a lot of times you have to find a window to sit down because if you keep running, you're going to run right into coverage and you're going to run right into a headache, okay? So those are the pieces that you have to recognize as a receiver just as much as Kirk Cousins has to recognize as a quarterback. So that's all the things that they've talked about. They've drilled it in practice this week. They're looking at it on their tablets all week long when they're at home studying, trying to find those little nuances that says, if I see this, and he creates this type of leverage or this type of pressure, how do I end up adjusting my route? These are all things that everybody has to be on the same page. But yes, if you get zone coverage behind some pressure, there are some openings. You're not necessarily always going to have as tight a coverage as long as you recognize it and you make the right adjustment and quarterback and receiver are on the same page.
Well, when that does happen, oftentimes the quarterback is getting pressured. And interestingly enough, for Kirk Cousins, he's actually pretty good against the pressure. Kirk versus any kind of blitz, his completion percentage is 62.8%. Against a zone blitz, 75%. Any pressure at all, 59.5%. That instills a lot of confidence in that quarterback, but also a lot of confidence almost in that pass pro as well.
Yeah, and that's where, again, it always comes back to be a line of scrimmage game, right? It no matter if you are passing, you're throwing it, which team dominates up front. And we just saw a full screen of 3 really talented pass rushers that Minnesota is going to be bringing against the Atlanta Falcons. Now, note on the right, Pat Jones, he's going to be inactive today. He's been dealing with an injury, but Pat Jones, Andrew Van Ginkel, those numbers both career highs when it comes to sack. Jonathan Grenard, he's got 10 sacks. That's the second highest in his career. His highest was last year when he had 12.5 sacks with the Texans. They've got 5 games left. So there's a chance that Jonathan Grenard ends up with a career high again. So they've got 3 guys that are having great seasons rushing the passer. They're having a ton of success doing it. So it's not like you can just circle one guy in Grenard because Van Ginkel has had a lot of success coming after the quarterback as well. Again, not going to see Jones today, but that doesn't mean somebody else can't factor into the equation. So it's a line of scrimmage game. How well does this offensive line play? Yes, protecting against that pressure, but also in the run game, which we'll talk a little bit about later.
Yeah, Van Ginkel was on the injury report this week. He's working through a thigh injury. He was a light participant all week this week, but he will play. And you mentioned it, Pat Jones not going to play today. But like we've seen in the recent history, there have been some banged up teams that don't have those great starters. but they still play very well. They have that great next man up mentality.
Yep, and that's what you want in the NFL. And unfortunately, Atlanta's kind of learned that the hard way. We went up against New Orleans Saints team that was banged up, and they came out on the losing side of that one. But last week against the Chargers, no J.K. Dobbins. Atlanta still ends up coming up on the losing end of that effort. It doesn't matter who's playing and who's not playing. You still have to go out and execute your half of the game plan. The other team, yes, they affect it, but when you're concerned about who's playing and who's not playing, you're not concerned about executing the play that comes in from the sideline. That's goal number one for Atlanta.
Let's talk about next man up mentality and Sam Darnold, because he came into this Vikings team thinking that he was going to be the unequivocal backup quarterback behind J.J. McCarthy. Of course, he was injured during training camp, and Sam Darnold kind of rose through the ashes and became this starter who has gone on a tear. Only lost 2 games for the Vikings so far this year. And obviously you can see in this graphic, he's kind of been everywhere. And something that everyone always says with guys that have resumes like Darnold is at every point of where you stay, like where you are, what teams you go to, you learn something different. And it almost makes this resume more impactful, even if you weren't a starter all those places, because you learn from really great starters, really great offensive schemes. And now you come in with the Vikings and you're playing lights out.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of getting the label as a journeyman, and you generally don't see that with a 3rd overall pick because they try to find every single opportunity to let you be the guy, right? But Sam Darnold has been, obviously he started the Jets, and we know what kind of has gone on with the Jets. It's been an organization that has struggled to find any kind of consistency, even at the quarterback position, and you throw his name into it. But then he's bounced around a couple of places, and even this year, not thinking that he's going to factor into the mix. And then all of a sudden you get the injury before the season starts to the presumed starter in J.J. McCarthy. And not only does he get turned over the keys to the franchise, but he's doing an excellent job in having success. Look at the numbers that he's doing as far as in comparison to the NFL. It is pretty impressive. But the thing I would also say is that throughout the course of his career, he has been sacked quite a bit, and he has had a propensity to throw interceptions. So there are opportunities, but you got a quarterback that is playing with confidence. And that's one of the best things that you can have at that position or at any position in the National Football League is somebody that goes in with a ton of confidence. And I truly believe that's what he's playing with right now.
Yeah, Darnold has led this Vikings team to having a 13th overall total offense so far this season. Last week against the Cardinals, it was his 10th game to have a 100 passer rating or higher. He had 100 passing yards in the 4th quarter alone. This guy is on a tear. And look, he's got guys to throw to as well in Jefferson and in Addison. Let's talk about these two because they have really become the faces of the NFL, and they're both on the same team. Dual threat wide receivers, and they are so dangerous on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, it's one of those where you can always come into the game and saying, yeah, we got to make sure that we keep Jefferson to a minimum because he is arguably the best wide receiver in the National Football League. By the way, one of 4 players all time that's had 1,000+ receiving yards in each of his first 5 years in the National Football League. By the way, the other 3, Mike Evans, A.J. Green, and Randy Moss. Pretty good company, right? So I think that kind of backs up how good Jefferson is, and already over 1,000 yards this year. Maybe not necessarily drawing as much as far as the touchdowns go, but I think this is one of those seasons where Justin Jefferson will probably tell you, I'm okay with my 5 touchdown receptions. You know why? Because we're winning. Yeah. And we're in great position to go to the postseason. And every good teammate is going to think about the team more than he's going to think about his individual numbers. But Jordan Addison, also a very accomplished receiver. They're going to have their hands full on both sides with these guys, not to mention the tight end position as well. So if Sam Darnold has enough time, if he plays with confidence that we talked about, and he throws with accuracy, it's going to be a challenge for this Atlanta Falcons defense. There's a reason why this team is 10-2 on the season.
Exactly. Let's talk about their running back, Aaron Jones, who came in as a free agent this year, and he's had a couple ball security moments that have left people a little nervous for this Vikings team. He lost 2 balls last week, and I think he actually he fumbled them but then recovered them for the Vikings last week against the Cardinals. When you look at Aaron Jones, everyone knows how he plays. Everyone knows what kind of running back he is, but what concerns you for Aaron Jones in those ball security moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got 5 fumbles this year, 3 of them lost, right? So yes, there has been a little bit of a common theme as far as him letting the football get popped out, get knocked out of his hands, and that's something that would concern you. But I think the other side of it and what Minnesota is going to look at is what he brings to our offense and how important he is. 820 rushing yards on the season, but even more importantly, 35 receptions for nearly 300 yards and a couple of touchdowns out of the backfield. So he's shown throughout his career that he can be a 3-down back. Coming over from the Green Bay Packers, he's now fit in nicely with the Minnesota Vikings, and he has provided that balance element. I think going into the season, you know you're going to have Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson. You're going to have a really lethal passing attack. But can you complement that with a running game that teams have to respect? And that's exactly what Aaron Jones has brought to this offense. He has brought the run game element to give them some play action, to give them the look to drive, to bring the linebackers up and open up those holes for the wide receivers downfield.
Yeah, you mentioned while we were talking about the wide receivers that if Sam Darnold is given time and he's given a clean pocket, he's probably going to go to Jefferson and Addison. But last week against the Chargers, the Falcons defense really shined, right? 5 sacks against Justin Herbert. What did you make about them last week, and what are you excited to see this week against the Vikings?
Yeah, it's one of those games where you're really truly hoping that Atlanta Falcons do 2 for 2. And what I mean by that is back up last week with another performance this week against a tough team on the road. 187 yards allowed against the Chargers, 56 rushing yards total, and of course did not give up many points. There was the interception that came offensively. They were able to get after the quarterback, which has been an issue for Atlanta the entire season. Additionally, getting quarterback hits, so getting into the backfield, making Justin Herbert feel the presence. Same thing has to happen today. You have got to find a way to let Sam Darnold feel the presence, and that is everybody on the defense, because we always talk about defensive line and linebackers, but you can bring secondary pressure, you can bring corner pressure to create some of that havoc, if you will, in the backfield. What we saw last week from the Falcons defense has got to go 2 for 2 this week against Minnesota. That's
right. I loved last week so much for this defense, especially this defensive front, because the wealth was spread pretty much throughout the defensive line. Arnold Ebiketie had 2 sacks. Grady Jarrett had 1. David Onyemata had 1. And then I think it was Eddie Goldman, or no, Contavious Street, who had the other sack. So the wealth was spread kind of all throughout that front 7, if you will. And then, of course, if they blitz, they love to bring Jesse Bates down. They love to bring Caden Ellis down. They got a lot of different things to put pressure on that quarterback. And I think we've kind of been saying all season long, we're going to see it click. We're gonna see it. Everyone just believe in it. We're going to see it. And I think last week against Chargers is when you saw that finally.
Yeah, I mean, the 5 sacks, and it's kind of the consistency. Well, it's been the opposite, right? The inconsistency for Atlanta this year, because there have been games where it's been 3 sacks, it's been 5 sacks, and so still last in the National Football League with 15 sacks on the season. A little bit of context, by the way, Broncos lead the NFL with 47 sacks this year. So that just shows the disparity of where Atlanta is in creating pressure. But it doesn't necessarily have to be 5 every week, but if it can be 3 or 4 every single week, that means you're probably stopping a couple of 3rd down drives, getting a couple of 3rd down stops to get the offense off the field and limit their opportunity to score points. So those are the things that you get those sacks on 3rd downs, and they end up stopping drives and taking points off the board. That's what has to happen more frequently for Atlanta.
Yeah, Rackley talking about things that have to happen today. So let's go ahead and get to the keys to the game presented by Wells Fargo. You got 3 for me today. What is your first one?
First one's pass protection. We talked a little bit about that. A lot of times in the NFL or any level of football, the game is won or lost on the line of scrimmage. And pass protection is going to be so important this week going up against a Minnesota team that comes in 39 sacks, 4th most in the National Football League, and they find ways to pressure the quarterback. So pass protection is going to be a premium this game. Generally starts with the center. Obviously, Kirk Cousins helping redirect things up front if you need to change the protection, but it's the communication across the offensive line. If they bring pressure, if they're bringing a corner off the short side of the field, do we recognize it? Do we make the appropriate adjustments to bump out and pick it up and not leave any free rushers coming right up the middle in the face of Kirk Cousins? Because we know that there's not the mobility there to get away from the pressure. So the communication and the execution on the offensive line is going to be huge in this game.
Yeah, we've talked about the offensive line a lot this week, or a lot this season, And last week we saw Drew Dahlman back under center. He's back and healthy. We'll probably see him again today under center. So we're going to see what happens with pass pro today against the Minnesota Vikings. What's your second cue to the game?
And it's going to be executing the run game. And this is one that I would probably say every week because of the offensive line and the running backs that Atlanta has in the backfield. But most notably, again, because of the opponent. Minnesota Vikings #1 in the National Football League as far as run defense goes, 81.3 yards per game. So teams are having a really difficult time running the football against this Minnesota defense. Again, goes back to the offensive line. Can you move the line of scrimmage? Can you create those seams? And then these running backs. We've seen all season long. Bijan Robinson finding ways to get away from tackles, sliding through the smallest of holes, or even using the physicality to be able to run people over and pick up extra yards. They've got to have this balanced element by executing in the run game, whether it's Robinson or Algier. Again, all starts on the offensive line, but it's got to be a movement on the offensive line. You have got to create movement up front. Play with physicality, play with a little nastiness. You got to win at the line of scrimmage if you want to win on the road.
I think today could be an angry runs day for one of these running backs. And I know last week and the weeks prior we've seen a lot of Bijan Robinson, and I would like to see a little bit more of Tyler Algier in there, especially because this feels like it's going to be an angry runs kind of day. You got to put your foot in the ground. You got to drive it forward, and Tyler Algier has shown time and time again that he can do it. Third and final today.
Third and final is going to be Rattle Sam Darnold, the quarterback. And we talked a little bit about this already. 5 sacks last week for the Atlanta Falcons. And yes, it would be great to say that they come with 5 sacks again in this game, but it's just rattle him, because sometimes that could just be pressure coming up the middle of the offensive line, and you get somebody that is right in his face, or there's a bunch of hands up in the air that are obscuring his vision down the field, or you get pressure and you got somebody falling at his feet, right? It's just finding ways to rattle him, getting him off his mark, forcing him to work his way through the progression, and even more, working his way through the progression on the run, right? Because he's trying to get away from pressure. Because we already talked about these receivers in the passing game that Minnesota has. They're going to have the advantage. The crowd's going to be nice and quiet when Minnesota is on offense, but they've got to find a way to rattle him, get him off his mark. As I said previously, he has been sacked in his career quite a bit of times, and he has thrown plenty of interceptions in his career. Even though he's having a great season, he's not bulletproof. Find a way to get to him throughout this game.
Yeah, and rattle him throughout the game, all 4 quarters, because last week against the Cardinals, I already mentioned it, made a huge comeback to win against the Cardinals at home, had 4 yards in passing last week in the 4th quarter alone. So you got to rattle him from the start of the game until the end. And of course, it's week 14. I have my preference, of course. What's new? My preference this week is to limit the yards after catch for these wide receivers and maybe even the tight end as well. We've talked a lot about the wide receivers today, especially Justin Jefferson. Listen, Jesse Bates said it in his press conference today, or earlier this week, excuse me, that yes, Justin Jefferson, he's going to get his catches in. He's going to get his receptions. But the key for this secondary today is to make sure that they get Jefferson and Addison on the ground as quickly as possible to limit those explosive plays. They're going to get their receptions today. I can guarantee it. But if you can limit their yards after catch to 3, 4, maybe even 0, then you're going to be in a right place at a right time and possibly pushing more towards 2nd and 3rd and longs, possibly, if you can limit their yards after catch.
Get them down on the ground.
Get them down.
That's it.
Tackle them.
Physicality, angry runs,
angry
defense
runs.
too.
We're going to see if we have some angry runs. I would love to see it. I haven't had an angry run since at Carolina when Tyler Algier pulled like 13, or not 13, there's not even 13 guys on the field. 8 guys.
They might have needed 13.
They probably did need 13. We're going to let you guys go, though, and turn on Fox. The game comes on at 1 p.m. today. Kirk Cousins making his return to U.S. Bank Stadium, hoping to get back in the win column. Bye, guys.